Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wilderness Science. Sorry, I can't be here today. I am, on maternity leave, but we can still do a little bit of learning. So, your first unit is going to be all about federal land use in the United States. And I know that sounds thrilling, but believe me, it's a really, really important bedrock for what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the year. So, when we're talking about federal lands, we're talking about lands that are managed by the federal government. So, what that means is in Wisconsin, we have a lot of private land. So, a lot of landowners that own farms, own real estate, own their own property, and not a ton, but we do have some public lands where anybody can go on them free of charge typically. So, an example of those public lands would be the Northern Kettle Moraine State Forest. That is partially where the Ice Age Trail runs, and it's not that far away from here. On that land, people can use it for multiple things. So when we're talking about land management, that Northern Kettle Moraine State Forest can be used for recreation. So there's a horseback riding trail. There are running trails that go through there. But it can also be used for timber. So in the New Fane area, it's a little bit south of here, there was a big timber harvest, and that is legal on those lands as well. So we can make money off of these lands, but they're also used for recreation. The agencies that are responsible for managing these federal lands, and that example is of a state land, but federal agencies that are responsible are the NPS, which is the National Park Service, the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, USFS, which is the United States Forest Service, and USGS, which is the U.S. Geological Survey. So those are kind of the overarching agencies that are responsible for managing all of these public lands that are basically your lands. So like I said before, they typically are going to manage these for multiple uses. So out west, where most of our federal lands are, as we're going to talk about later in this unit, they can manage these lands for cattle grazing, for mining, for recreation, timber harvest, so many different things that we can use this land for. And what they do in order to keep this a sustainable practice, so sustainable means to be able to be used for many, many years, is mitigation. And this is one of the keys in management. And mitigation, I always think of put that thing back where it came from, so help me. So logging and mining companies, when they log or mine, they have legal and fine repercussions that are in effect if they don't plant trees again or put the earth back after a mining activity. And we'll talk about some of the caveats of that a little bit later in this unit, but this is kind of how the federal government manages these lands so they are good for these purposes for many, many years to come. What we are also concerned with is habitat health. So, a lot of these lands should be managed for getting rid of wildlife diseases or plant diseases, making sure the biodiversity stays up. So, there's lots of different types of plants and animals. It should always be the top issue, but it's not always that way because of our next point, which is the goals of the stakeholders. So the stakeholders, once again, we're going to talk about more about it later in our unit, is who is concerned in this issue. So if there is an issue, for example, about your grades, who are the stakeholders in your grade? Who are the people that care? Well, you should care. You should be one of the stakeholders. Your parent or guardian should also care about your grades and how you're doing in school and what you're learning. Your teachers, the school board, all of those different people are stakeholders in that. So when we're talking about these public lands, local national governments, local national organizations, political groups, citizens that live in these areas, private interests, so different companies, all of these are stakeholders that want to use these lands for their own intents and purposes. And the land gets managed how they see fit. And this can be good or it can be bad. So this leads us into talking about conservation versus preservation. So what I want you guys to think about right off the bat is what do these two terms mean? Conservation and preservation. These are the two prevailing thoughts in how we are going to manage these lands. So what do you think these terms mean? So either pause the video here or turn and talk to your neighbor if you're listening to this in class. What do you think these two terms mean? Conservation versus preservation. So just think about that for a minute. Are you done? Okay. So when you're doing this, please fill out your conservation versus preservation worksheet. Come up with your initial definitions. We are going to move on to our next slide and talk about what these things actually are. So what conservation and preservation are is conservation is the proper use of nature. So this is using the land for natural purposes, logging, mining, recreation, but it's also keeping it sustainable and healthy. So if we log, we're not going to clear cut without replanting those trees. Preservation is protection from use. So there are some areas in the United States that are preserves, and that means that we can't change anything that's there. Only foot travel and hoof travel, so horseback riding, is allowed in some of these wilderness areas. So if you look at the little infographic on the bottom, conservation is protecting these natural resources for the use of current and future generations. And when we're talking about these things, Native Americans or First Nations people in the United States are really, really spearheaded this conservation movement, and they really encompass this. And there actually was an idea in some nations called the 7 generations principle, that whatever you do to the land, you have to make sure it is the way you want it or the way it should be 7 generations from now. So you shouldn't do anything with the land that's going to ruin it for 7 generations from now, which is a very, very long time. Preservation, on the other hand, this is preventing most human usage. So this is why you can only travel on foot in certain places. National parks are preservation as well. So even though there are buildings and different things like that in national parks, you cannot log in national parks, you cannot hunt in national parks. It's leave no trace. That is preservation. So when we are talking about these different things, we also have some different players in our game. So the first guy that we have is John Muir, and we are going to hear a lot about John Muir, talk a lot about him. He's a very, very interesting dude. I mean, look at that beard, super cool. He's actually Scottish American, and he grew up in Wisconsin. So his family immigrated from Scotland when he was very young. He grew up in Wisconsin. He actually studied at UW-Madison as well, and he became a worker in sawmills and logging camps, and he studied forestry, and he traveled all over the United States. He walked from Kentucky to the Gulf of Mexico, 1,000 miles, and journaled it. Super cool, interesting dude. And eventually, his travels and working in these sawmills, he found work in Yosemite, California. And he kind of struggled with the idea of cutting down these trees for profit, but also protecting redwood forests. And he really, really struggled with this and this dichotomy. So he actually co-founded the Sierra Club in 1892, which is still an organization to this day. And it was actually initially to protect that Yosemite Valley. He actually caught the attention of Theodore Roosevelt and pitched the idea of national parks, which Roosevelt took and ran with. So John Muir, guy from Wisconsin, is kind of responsible for having national parks, which is pretty interesting, pretty cool. So now we got to talk about my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, look at that guy, right? So Teddy Roosevelt was the 26th president of the United States. He was actually from New York State and grew up very, very wealthy. He, as a child, was very small. He was pretty short statured, and he was very sickly. So he had really bad asthma problems and different things like that. He was really weak. and he did not want to be seen as weak and frail. So he dedicated his life to living a strenuous life. And he started hunting, mountain climbing, swimming in ice cold lakes, wrestling, and he became a true dynamo. He actually went to Harvard University. He was on the wrestling team. Um, Later on in his life, he had a lot of turmoil. His mother and his first wife actually died on the same day in the same house in New York City, and he fled to North Dakota. And he started his own cattle ranch, which is actually where Teddy Roosevelt National Park currently is. And this act kind of changed his life. He really appreciated nature, the calming effects that it had, living off the land. He experienced all of this and hunting and going all over the United States. And it kind of changed his trajectory and really, really helped him to be the conservationist president. There has been no president since Teddy Roosevelt that has done as much for the environment as he did. In fact, on a campaign stop in California, he actually left. It's a cool story. He left and like snuck away and went camping with John Muir for 3 days in Yosemite Valley, where John Muir pitched to him the idea of national parks and preservation, although Teddy Roosevelt was more of a conservationist. So he wanted to hunt and fish and log, but keep nature healthy, where John Muir was more of a preservationist and wanted to set aside lands. So Teddy Roosevelt really, really compromised with the idea of national parks. So on this camping trip in 1903, they started at Mariposa Grove and continued to a bunch of different places that are now within Yosemite National Park. And Muir really, really stressed the idea of protecting these different swaths of land. And it's a really famous picture below of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir standing over Yosemite Valley. The outcomes of this, like I alluded to and said before, was Roosevelt actually established the National Park Service, and he created 5 initial national parks. He also drafted the 1906 Antiquities Act, which immediately helped him protect 18 national monuments. One of these was Devil's Tower in Wyoming, if anybody's ever been there. The first national park was Yellowstone National Park, as I'm sure many people have heard about before. Lots of big famous things. And actually, the Antiquities Act has helped even current presidents and more recent presidents to set aside lands to be preserved for national historic significance. Teddy Roosevelt also set aside 51 bird reserves and migratory bird breeding grounds. He was quite the birder, loved birds. 4 game preserves and 150 national forests. I believe it was about 2.2 million acres of land that he set aside to be protected under his presidency. So you guys can watch this video. It's a really good video kind of about this whole trip. Oh, we're not going to watch it yet. What am I doing? All right. And then you guys can watch this video in there as well and his conservation influences just to get a little bit more background information. All right. Our next big conservation player was George Byrd Grinnell. He was from New York State as well, and he was actually a professor of zoology, and he was actually credited with helping to save the bison because they almost went extinct. And we'll talk about that in a later unit in the year. But he was really credited with helping to save their bison populations. With Teddy Roosevelt, he helped co-found the Boone and Crockett Club, which is still a club today that is actually a hunting organization that focuses on conservation of lands. And they're also the big record holders for size of trophies. So like the size of elk antlers or deer or different things like that. Another very important gentleman was this gentleman, Gifford Pinchot. We'll talk about him when we talk about forest fires in a later unit. And he was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt. He was the one who actually pioneered fighting forest fires in the United States. And he helped to triple the size of these forest reserves and set them aside for logging, recreation, industry. He kind of butted heads with Muir a little bit as he was more about industry and conservation and not necessarily strict preservation of lands, but he has a really interesting story as well. Super important guy. Next, we have Aldo Leopold. And this gentleman was actually from Wisconsin as well. He was a professor at UW-Madison, and he wrote a very, very famous book called The Sand County Almanac in 1949. And it was a series of short stories, prose, poems, memoirs, all about his observations of nature. And he really, really helped to develop environmental ethics and wilderness conservation. And he was really one of the big founders of the science of wildlife management. So when we talk about wildlife management in a later unit, Aldo Leopold from UW-Madison, he pioneered that, which is really cool. So we've had John Muir and Aldo Leopold both from Wisconsin. And then last, we have Rachel Carson. So it would be remiss to leave Miss Carson out of the list of key players in the conservation preservation game. She was a biologist and wrote the book Silent Spring in 1962. This book was about concerns of pollution. So this was kind of the first whistle that was blown that said, hey, dumping chemicals in water is bad. It took us till 1962 to have somebody say that we were actually poisoning our environment doing certain things. So one of these chemicals was DDT. So some of you might remember from regular bio, we talked about DDT, and it actually thins the shells on eggs, and it caused bald eagles to almost go extinct in the US. And that's not great for us because that's our national bird. So she kind of was the big whistleblower about this and really, really helped to make people more aware of things that we do, in fact, affect nature. So, for a first assignment mini project, what I would like for you folks to do is to pick one of the people that was mentioned in the slides and then make either a one-page infographic, so you can do that on one of those infographic websites, or just a short one-page essay, so one page, Times New Roman, size 12 font, double space, and include the education that that person got. So all of them I talked about already, but I want you to pick one and look a little more into their life. I want you to look more at contributions to conservation preservations or the environment that they had, and what were some lasting impacts of their work. So once again, either create an infographic with information or a one-page essay. And if you look on Schoology, it says historical figures in the environment. The rubric is in that assignment as well.